Let's turn our attention now then to Luke chapter 15. It's not uncommon, particularly in the realm of politics. Don't you hate it when that's an illustration? To hear somebody say something like this: what was intended as an insult, I wear proudly as a badge of honor. You've heard that phrase before, right? Especially, seemed like Trump, that happened all the time under President Trump, because, he would say something intending to insult somebody, and the people, they were glad that a guy like Trump would insult him. They didn't want to be on his side anyway, and so whatever phrase. I remember, it seems to me, my memory's not real solid, I didn't look this up, but I think back during the previous election, that kind of happened with Hillary. I think Hillary said some things that the more conservative base kind of took and said, yeah, if that's what she wants to call us, we'll just take that insult and we'll wear it as a badge of honor. I remember years ago it was flyover country. Do you remember that? Rush used to make a big deal out of that, where the cultural elites treated people like us in the middle of the country. We're not even worth the time. I just assume they leave us alone and forget about us anyway. But that was kind of what was intended to be an insult. Flyover country was worn by some, like ditto heads, as a badge of honor, right? You understand what I'm talking about? That's really, in essence, what's happening here in Luke 15. Do you get what's happening? All of Luke 15 is premised on an insult that Jesus embraces and says, yep, you're right. What you intend as an insult, Jesus says, I'm going to wear as a badge of honor. Did you catch the insult? If you miss the first 3 verses of Luke 15 and skip right to the 3 stories, you don't understand the stories. The first 3 verses set us up and explain everything that follows. So we dare not miss those first 3 verses. Look at them. Luke 15, verse 1. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him. By the way, do you remember how Luke 14 ended? You don't have to remember. You just let your eyes drift upward just a little bit. And Jesus had ended that section by saying, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. And now the people who are hearing, the people who have ears, are these tax collectors and sinners, right? They drew near to hear him. Verse 2, and the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. And you understand, that to them was an insult. They thought that they were just ripping Jesus, that by their thinking, by their perspective, by their standards, like that's a really, really insulting statement to make. This man receives sinners. You know that eating with somebody, especially in this culture, was an act of friendship. It was an act of intimacy. It was an act of relationship. And so here they're saying this man receives sinners, as evidenced by the fact that he eats with them. So, verse 3, he told them, now I think this is huge, he told them these parables. Is that what it says? He told them, singular, this parable. We have 3 stories, but we have 1 parable. Folks, that is huge if you want to properly understand. What I know this is so familiar, and there's a danger, familiarity, easy for me to say, familiarity breeds contempt. But one of the things I think sometimes people they get into the minutia of these stories and they miss the point of the stories, and the point is singular. There's 1 parable here. There's 1 point. And all 3 of these need to be understood together, not separately. And may I suggest to you that these 3 stories all have the same 3 characters that are introduced to us in verses 1 to 3. You don't have to wonder, you don't have to think, this is not, it's so simple, but it's so important and it's so beautiful. I learned so much studying this. I've known the prodigal son since I was a little kid, but I learned so much this week, and it's so important that we get this. Listen, there are only 3 characters, or kind of groups of characters, categories of characters in all 3 stories. And they're introduced in verses 1 through 3. They're the tax collectors and sinners, right? That's going to be the lost sheep, the lost coin, and 2 lost sons. Now strike that, the younger son, the younger son. Okay? And then they drew near to hear him. Who's the him? Jesus. That's the shepherd seeking the lost sheep. That's the woman seeking the lost coin. And that's the father in the third story. They're all Jesus. Right? Because this is one parable. And then there are, verse 2, the Pharisees and scribes. Who are they? The 99 sheep, the 9 coins, and the elder brother. So if you get verses 1 through 3, you've already got the foundation. You've got an understanding of everything else. You out there? Now, somebody said, you put Luke 15 in your email, and was that a mistake? Because how in the world are you covering 32 verses? And the answer is, I'm not going to cover all of it. We're just going to take one character. We're going to take the main character this morning, and then we're going to take the other 2 characters maybe next week, maybe second and third. We'll see. But anyway, today it's just the main character. Who's the main character? In fact, even the way we title these stories is a misnomer. We talk about the parable of the lost sheep and the lost coin and the lost son or sons. They're not the main characters, are they? You notice how all 3 of these stories start? What man of you having 100 sheep? There's the main character right in the first line. That's Jesus. And then in verse 8, or what woman having 10 coins? That's the main character, not the coins. It's the woman. And then verse 11, he said there was a man. The man is first, not the 2 sons. The main character here is Jesus. The one who hears what is intended to be an insult, and he says, yep, and he takes it and he runs with it. The fact that this is a parable, this parable, singular, let me just give you a couple principles of interpretation that are important both for this week and for next week. The first principle is this: no single illustration captures Christ's character and work. Right? Illustrations all fall short. Anytime you use the finite to try to illustrate the infinite, there are going to be problems in your illustration, right? So you don't take illustrations too far, and that's why you need multiple illustrations to try to get one point across, right? That's the first principle. You out there? Give me a nod or a shake or something, all right? Okay, second principle, and really important in this context, not every detail in illustrations means something. Please hear that principle. Some people try to allegorize, and they try to find a meaning behind every single detail, particularly in the prodigal son, right? And you're just going to be led astray if that's what you're thinking. It's not intended for every detail to translate. Let me give you just quickly some examples. First of all, here we do not have a lesson on the Trinity. I actually, my first email to the guys who helped plan the service, I said, there may be something about the Trinity. Or some guys read this and they say, well, the shepherd is clearly Jesus when you look at other passages in the Bible, and the Father is clearly God the Father in the third story, so it must be that the woman is the Spirit, and this must be a Trinitarian teaching. Well, what's the problem with that? The problem is that's not what the text says. There's one main character, and all of these are pointing to Jesus, the one who's been insulted. This man is represented by the shepherd. This man who receives sinners is represented by the woman. And while it may be a little bit confusing, this man who receives sinners is represented by a father. But by the way, is this the only time in the Bible where Jesus is called a father? Remember Isaiah's prophecy? Prince of Peace? Remember that list? Everlasting Father. So yeah, it may be a little bit confusing, but understand, and by the way, Jesus, one of the reasons he came was to reveal the Father to us. Don't think that Jesus is somehow different from God the Father. Jesus is revealing God the Father. But this is about Jesus. I hope that didn't muddy the waters. So we don't try to make those details into something that they're not. This is one parable, not And not those details are not necessarily significant. And can I just some maybe silly examples of this? This is not a parable on good parenting. Right? Like, so we don't read this and say, oh, the Father is pointing us to Jesus. Maybe this, no, this is really an example of really poor parenting. This is an overly indulgent dad. Like, he shouldn't have given that brat of a younger son, right? But if we get hung up on that, we're missing the point. You know that guy? You know the guy you're watching a movie with and has to poke holes in all the plot points that don't, that some people watch just to find plot holes. Don't do that when you read. You're missing the point. This is not about parenting, nor is it about dancing. One of the commentators I read went off on, well, clearly Jesus is not endorsing dancing. You could guess his background and bent on this. And so that is such an aside. We don't want to make, and then the third category, some people try to make a big deal. What's the robe? What's the ring? What are the shoes? What do they represent? A robe, a ring, and shoes. Like, don't make the robe into the robes of righteousness, okay? That's not the point. Okay? I hope that's helpful, and I think it's especially important when we get to this next week. All of that to say this, there are 3 stories that are really giving us one parable, so focus on the similarities, not on the differences. Okay? You can really get sidetracked if you focus on all the differences. Here are the similarities regarding the main character, Jesus, this man who receives sinners. There are 3 similarities. Number 1 is really that statement found in verse 2. This man receives sinners. He's accepting. He's really embracing. There's an openness, again, intended as a scandal, intended as shameful, intended as an insult. Jesus takes this and says, yep, you're right. It's seen particularly that the statement is in verse 2, but it's really what Jesus kind of digs in on when he talks about the Father receiving the younger son, right? How does the Father respond when the younger son comes home? Isn't it a beautiful picture? Look at verse 20. The younger son, he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Now, you know from earlier, he had a longer speech planned. He doesn't even get to the rest of the speech. Why? Verse 22, because the father interrupts him and says to his servants, bring quickly the best robe and put it on him and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet and bring the fattened calf and kill it and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he is found. And they began to celebrate. You understand, don't you, that this is contemptible in the eyes of Jesus' culture. This is scandalous. This father's response in a shame versus honor culture, an Eastern culture, honor versus dishonor, this is dishonoring. This father is dishonoring himself. First of all, Eastern aged men don't run. I mean, there's a real chance he's actually being immodest, because think about the clothing of the day. He's having to hike up that long flowing robe. He's probably even immodest in the act. You just don't do this in that day. In fact, a story's told of a Chinese Christian who wanted to represent this story, and he painted a picture of the father, and he asked somebody who knew the Bible. He said, "What do you think of this?" He says, "There's a big problem. You're showing him walking." And he says, "Well, yeah, I did that on purpose. You don't understand. Chinese men just don't run." And his friend said, "Exactly. Neither did Jewish men." That's the point of the parable. He's accepting shame and scandal and insult in his loving reception of his son. That's his heart. His love for his son overflows to the point that this is okay. I don't care about the scandal. I don't care about the dishonor. I don't care about the shame. This man receives sinners. He kissed him. I like that. He receives him and he kissed him. In fact, the language here, he just kept on kissing him, just kissing and kissing and kissing his son. Earlier in Luke, do you remember the woman who anointed Jesus' feet? You remember that? And we kind of read that and we get it, right? She remember Jesus said to the Pharisee, you didn't offer even to have your servant wash my feet. Certainly you didn't wash my feet when I entered, which would have been an act of hospitality, like common courtesy. And that didn't happen from the Pharisee, but Jesus said, this woman has not stopped kissing my feet. Not just washing them, kissing them. Washing them with her hair and her tears. Remember that? Right? Well, that makes sense. Like, because she was a sinner that had been forgiven, it makes sense for sinners to kiss the feet of Jesus, but how scandalous for Jesus to kiss the sinner. Do you get the picture here? That's what's going on. See, this man receives sinners. But it's as if Jesus says, you ain't seen nothing yet. Not only does this man receive sinners, but Jesus says, I'll see that and I'll raise you. This man recovers sinners. He doesn't just sit passively by and wait for sinners to come to him. He actually goes out and seeks the sinners. I almost used the word rescue here. This man rescues sinners, which is true enough. But maybe I'm putting too fine a point on this, but I don't know if this is true or not, but I watch too much TV, and when you see television programs or movies about first responders, and there's a search and rescue operation, you know what I'm talking about? Somebody's lost. Well, if too much time passes, they lose hope, and it goes from search and rescue to search and recovery. And I'm using the word recovery. You want to know why? Because Dad said, this, my son, was dead, and he's alive. Right? So I'm using the word, this man recovers sinners. And he doesn't just sit passively by. He goes out and seeks for these sinners. That's clearly, again, it's the repeated emphasis in the passage. Verse 4, Luke 15:4, what man of you having 100 sheep, if he's lost even one of them, does not leave the 99 in the open country and go after? He goes after the one that is lost until he finds it. Not just going to go and search for a little while. I'm going to search until I find it, says Jesus. And then what about the woman, the second story? Verse 8, what woman having 10 silver coins, if she loses one coin, does not light a lamp and sweep the house and seek diligently until she finds it? This man goes on this search and recovery mission, this search and recovery operation. Jesus saying, I do more than receive sinners. I go after them. And then here's what's interesting. I can't wait to get to this next week. He doesn't, the father in the third story doesn't really, again, if you see what the point is, it's in the similarities. He doesn't seek the first son. The first son comes back on his own. Who does he go seeking? Who does the father seek in the second story? Well, there's only one character left. The older brother. Right? See, the younger brother comes back on his own, and then what happens? Well, verse 25, the older son was in the field. He drew near to the house. He heard music and dancing. He called one of the servants, asked him what these things meant, and he said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has received him back safe and sound. But he, the older brother, was angry, and he refused to go in. So what happened? His father came out and entreated him. Again, scandalous to that culture. But this father, as warmly as he received the younger brother, it's probably even more amazing, or it should be, if we understand this, that he actually sought the older one. He came out and he entreated him. Isn't that a beautiful picture of Jesus? A shepherd a woman, and a father who recovers sinners. Everybody has a story about seeking, right? I mean, everybody has some story, something in the past, something in the family. In our family, the one that came to my mind is when Sarah was really, really young, like really little. There was one day, all of a sudden, Janice goes, I can't find Sarah. And Sarah was probably relatively the best behaved of my kids, and so it was like, this is weird. But we couldn't find her, and so we're yelling and we're searching the house. I mean, we got so desperate. I mean, we're outside. Janet, I remember Janet. You know that kind of the stages of grief. Janet, she was angry. Sarah, this isn't funny. Where are you? Are you hiding? I mean, it was that kind of thing. But then it turned into tears and fear, and I mean, all kinds of and running around outside. I got in the car and started driving the neighborhood. We were looking. She was in her bed, covered up, and she was so little that we didn't notice the lump in the bed, and then she just fallen asleep, and she didn't hear us. But that little period of searching scared us to death. But you better believe we were searching diligently. You understand that's what Jesus is saying here, seeking diligently until he finds. What is the until? What is the until he finds? To what lengths? How far would Jesus go? Even the death of the cross. Philippians 2. That's how far he goes. Even to death until he finds the lost ones that he's seeking. This man receives sinners. This man, even more, recovers sinners. And then, number 3, this man rejoices over sinners found. That's obvious, right? You read this, you can't miss the joy all over these stories, right? One parable, and here's Jesus like, yep, I do. I receive sinners, and I receive them joyfully. You get the picture? You get the idea? Look, it's all over the place in the passage. Look at verse 5. When he has found it, the shepherd, when the shepherd's found the lost sheep, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and his neighbors, saying to them, rejoice with me, for I found my sheep that was lost. Just so I tell you, there will be more joy. I mean, Jesus interprets this for us. He's not just talking about reception, he's talking about rejoicing. There will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. And then again, verses 9 and 10. And when she has found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, rejoice with me, for I have found the coin that I had lost. Just so I tell you, there is joy before the angels of God over one sinner who repents. And I just read for you moments ago the celebration and the joy with which the father received that younger son. And he re-emphasizes that, doesn't he? At the very end when he's talking to the older son, verse 32, it was fitting. That's not a strong enough word. I'm not sure, ESV translators are way smarter than I, but they got this wrong. It was necessary, is the word. Not just fitting. It was necessary to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. This is a necessary thing. It's a must. Luke's already used this word several times in his gospel. And think about this. For example, you remember in Luke 2 where Jesus got lost? And his parents came searching for him, and he's kind of, well, duh, Mom and Dad, didn't you know I must be in my Father's house? Just as certainly as Jesus must be in his Father's house, so Jesus must rejoice when a sinner repents. You get this? And then Jesus said in Luke chapter 4, I must preach the gospel. Do you get the force of this? Just as strongly as Jesus must preach the gospel, Jesus must rejoice in heaven with him when a lost sinner repents. And then in chapter 9, Jesus says, I must go to Jerusalem and suffer. Do you understand that rejoicing over the salvation of sinners is on par with the cross? I'm going to go suffer. In fact, he endured the cross, despising the shame. For the what? For the what? The joy that was set before him. This is the must. And then he talked about the woman that was bound and that was loosed on the Sabbath day. It was not just fitting that she was loosed on a Sabbath day, a day of freedom. It was a must. It was necessary. It just made sense. It fits. It's a must. And so is it a must that Jesus rejoices, that heaven rejoices with him. And really what he's saying to those stick-in-the-mud Pharisees and tax collectors and scribes is you ought to as well. This is a must. Folks, the point here this morning that I want us to try to grab hold of is that we need to know Jesus. We need to know his character and his work. We need to see these truths, first of all, about him. Before we think about the truths about the Pharisees and tax collectors, the older brother, before we see the truths about I got that mixed up, the Pharisees and scribes are the elder brother, the tax collectors, sinners, prostitutes, they're the younger brother. Before we see either of them, we need to know God. This is foundational, a knowledge of God. We're into an age of self-awareness. I need to know myself. We're so self-absorbed as a culture, and we got to know ourselves. And then when we know ourselves, we got to express ourselves. And all this self. Well, you do not know yourself if you don't know God. Let me quickly try. I'll try to be quick. Let me try to quickly give you 6 reasons why you need to know this man. This man who receives sinners, this man who recovers sinners, this man who rejoices over sinners found. There are 6 reasons, I think textually, I think I can root these in the text, 6 reasons why you and I need to know this man. Number 1, if you don't know this man, you may grumble about him. Right? I mean, that's right off the bat in verse 2. I mean, really, in essence, what Jesus is saying to the Pharisees and the scribes, he's saying, the fact that you grumble, the Pharisees and scribes grumbled, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. Jesus is in essence saying, you don't understand who I am. You don't understand who God is. And listen folks, if you don't know this man, then you are susceptible to grumbling. Like the elder brother, you can get angry with God. You can get accusatory towards God. I'm not saying we always understand what God's doing, but our response when we don't understand is huge. When we don't understand what God's doing or why is he doing it, are we getting angry and accusatory? Are we grumbling against God? Or do we know him well enough to say, God, I don't have a clue, I don't understand, I don't like what you're doing, but I trust you. You're not going to trust him. You're not going to trust him. When you don't understand him, you're not going to trust him unless you know something of who he is. And I think this is part of what Jesus is saying here. You may not understand what he's doing, but you can know. You know that old saying, when you can't trace God's hand, what? Trust his heart. When you can't trace his hand, trust his heart. If you don't know him, you may grumble about him. Number 2, if you don't know this man, you can't worship God correctly. If you don't know this man, again, this is Jesus. If you don't know Jesus, if you don't know this man, you can't worship him correctly. My granddaughter has discovered the Muppets. And so we're actually in Disney Plus going all the way back to I think in the 70s, right? When the Muppet Show was first on. And so I'm getting a kick out of it, probably way more than she is, sadly. So when she says she's the puppets, I watch the puppets. Okay, that's good with me. And so we're watching. And you guys remember Sam Eagle?
Sam Eagle, talks like this, and his whole job on the Muppet Show is to maintain the moral integrity of the show.
Remember, that's some people's concept of God. Big brow, furrowed,
whose job is to maintain the moral integrity of your life.
Now, I'm not saying God is immoral or that he's not holy, but I am saying God does not walk around with a frown on his face all the time. And if you don't know God, can I tell you, you're not going to worship him like you ought to worship him. You're not going to draw near. Jordan, I think, prayed maybe 2 weeks in a row now about drawing near to God. What do you want to draw near to Sam Eagle for? I mean, what a sourpuss. Nobody wants to draw near to Sam Eagle. You laugh at him, but you don't draw near to him, right? But we're called to draw near to God. Why? Because he's already promised to draw near to us. He's this Father that sees us a long way off and runs and hugs and kisses and lavishes scandalously His love on His children. You know, there are two categories of God's attributes that Bible teachers talk about. There is transcendence and His immanence. Transcendence is the fact that He is high and lifted up, and certainly we need to remember that. Amen? I'm not saying we forget that, but maybe in an age where some of us tire of a flippant and casual approach that many people have to God, we kind of overcorrect, and all we want to think about is transcendence without recognizing this is a God who draws near. So that, listen, worship is not just a matter of reverence because of transcendence. Worship is a matter of intimacy and joy and celebration because He is not a God afar off. He's a God who came after us and loves us and lavishes us with that love. This is true. In fact, all those verses it was just talked about, this man rejoicing over sinners found, all of those verses that we just looked through on there, it's not only rejoices, but it's also rejoice with. Did you notice that? Like the shepherd didn't just rejoice. He found the sheep, he rejoiced, but then what did he do? He called his friends, and he says, rejoice with. That's actually one word in the Greek. So there's not only rejoicing, but there's rejoicing with. And then a woman, when she found the coin, what did she do? She didn't just rejoice, she called her girlfriends. They had a girls' night out. That's what they did. They had a girls' night out. And she didn't just rejoice, she rejoiced with. And the Bible calls us not only to worship God, but to worship God with. Right? Corporate worship. And so in a day, again, of high individualism in our culture, where I can worship God just as well all by myself when I'm out on the golf course or out in the woods. No, you cannot. Not if you understand. You need to worship God with. And part of worshiping God with is celebrating. Folks, there's no doubt that the Bible teaches reverence. Again, I do not want to diminish that. Maybe that is more lacking generally in the world around us, but what is potentially more lacking in here is the celebrating. I'm not too worried about Calvary being irreverent in its worship, but I may be a little bit concerned that we don't celebrate enough. You know, maybe my favorite time for a number of reasons is when I get to baptize somebody and then we sing Happy Day. Because you all just look happy when you sing Happy Day. You do. And that's the way it ought to be as we celebrate a God who saves, who came after us, and we ought to be mindful of that every day. But when we get to see the fact that He came after somebody else and saved their soul, it ought to stir our hearts to rejoicing as well. We ought to sing with amazement and joy because of the grace whereby though we were lost, now we are found. And though we were dead, now we are alive. If you don't know this man, you may want his stuff more than you want him. That's a third reason. If you don't know this man, you may want his stuff more than you want him. Really, that's both of the brothers, right? I mean, the younger son, you've heard other preachers say this probably. In effect, what the younger son says is, Dad, I can't wait till you die to get my inheritance. Give it to me now. You know, we say, I can't wait all the time, but we don't mean it literally. In fact, we can wait because usually we have to. I can't wait till vacation. Well, sorry, but you have to, right? I mean, and we do. No choice. Or I can't wait to whatever. But this son is effectually saying, I can't wait till you die. Give it to me now. What a horrible thing, not recognizing the privilege of having this man as your father. and wanting his stuff more than you want him. And you know what? Really, that's what the elder brother said as well. I mean, there's a part of that story. Remember what he said? He said, you didn't give me a goat to celebrate, remember the last three words of that verse? With my friends. I don't want to party with you, Dad. I don't want to be with you. And that's how the dad responds. You are always with me. That was way better than a goat. Right? You are always with me. That's the prize. But I want a goat so I can party with my friends. I would rather be with my friends than with my dad. I experienced that. I know it. I mean, kids go, yeah, I'd rather hang out with my friends. But this is certainly a whole new level. If we don't know this man, you may want his stuff more than him. Number 4, if you don't know this man, you'll find it difficult to ask him for forgiveness. If you don't know this man, you'll find it difficult to ask him for forgiveness. Who would it be easier to say, I was wrong, will you forgive me? Who'd be easier to say that to? Sam Eagle or this father? Right? A Sam Eagle type?
My job is to uphold the moral integrity of the Muppet Show.
You say it to that guy? Like, I'm not sure if he's going to forgive me or not. I mean, that guy's, wow. Or to say it to the guy, you say, Dad, would you stop kissing me long enough? I got a speech. Like, is there any doubt in this son's mind? I think Dad's going to forgive me. Probably it was on when he came running, right? When he came running, when he scandalized himself. You get if you don't know him, look, they're all, I'm not just talking about in salvation. Certainly this is true in salvation. I think so the reason some people are hesitant to come to God for salvation, for the forgiveness of sins initially, is because they just don't know him. That's why the Bible says that Satan blinds their mind to God's glory. But what the gospel does is gives them sight to God's glory. The God who would send his son to die so that you can be forgiven for your sins is a God you can have confidence in, that when I say, God, please forgive me, he's going to say yes. Right? And not only in salvation, but after salvation, just in restoration, how do we keep short accounts with God? Folks, listen, if your mental picture of God is more like Sam Eagle than the father in this story, then when you sin, you're not going to run to him. I got to make it up to him. I mean, I stink. I'm horrible, and God's got to be really just ticked off at me or disappointed in me, and I've got to make it up to him somehow. No, you don't. Do you see? He's just waiting. He's just waiting. When you know him, when you see his face smiling at you, eager to receive you, it's not hard to say, God, I was wrong. I am guilty. I may not be worthy to be called your son, but I know you well enough that you'll receive me back. You don't know him, you'll find it difficult to ask him for forgiveness. Number 5, if you don't know this man, you'll think like a slave instead of like a son. You see the elder brother, when you get to the end of this story, literally the word it's in verse 29. He answered his father, these many years I have served you. See that word served? That's literally the word for slave. I have slaved away. In fact, he had a mindset, I am my dad's slave. It's even stronger. The word that the younger brother used was a hired hand, a hired servant. But this older brother, he never left, but he was as far from his dad as was the younger brother in a distant country. He didn't know him. He thought, I have to slave. I have to earn my keep. I have to earn my inheritance. I have to work for it. And that's what happens if you don't know this man. If you don't know this man, you'll think like a slave instead of a son. When we are legalistic in our mindset, I've got to work, I've got to earn, I've got to do, It takes you one of two directions, either pride or despair. If you're so convoluted like this older brother to think, I got this. Man, Dad must be really happy. I am a good slave. I have earned my keep. I mean, that is such a again, he didn't know his father and he didn't know himself. But if it doesn't lead you to pride, it'll lead you to despair, because you'll quickly realize, I'm nowhere close to measuring up. But we don't have to think like slaves. We can think like sons if we know this man. Are you out there? It's important to know him, to know that he receives sinners, that he recovers sinners, and that he rejoices over sinners found. Last one quickly is this. If you don't know this man, you won't become like him. If you don't know this man, you won't become like him. One of the reasons that we should behold the glory of Jesus in Luke 15 is so that he transforms us into the same image from one degree of glory to the next. Again, when you understand the three characters in this, I think Jesus is addressing the sinners, the tax collectors, and encouraging them by saying, I know that these guys are saying that this is an insult, but I just want to encourage you and kind of reinforce the fact I do receive sinners. You guys are good. Keep coming. But really, I think the main thing that Jesus is doing in Luke 15 is he's addressing the older brother. He's addressing the 99 who don't think they need repentance. He's addressing the Pharisees and the scribes. And he's saying, look, instead of griping and grumbling and accusing and being angry over what I'm doing with these sinners, you ought to be like me. You ought to rejoice when a sinner comes home. You ought to rejoice when the lost is found and when the dead are made alive. But if we don't know him, we could never become like him. Do you know that there are actually people who are okay as long as I talk about God, just so I never get around to application? No, you can talk about theology all you want, but just don't tell me that this has any implications for how I ought to live. Now, there are other people who try to do application without theology. That is a grave error as well. You understand the reason that we do theology this morning, the reason we want to know this man who receives sinners, who recovers sinners, who rejoices, the reason we know him is because this doctrine has implications for how you and I live. So, question, am I like, look, if I'm not increasingly becoming like Jesus, it's because I don't know him. I don't care how many theology tests you can ace. What Jesus is saying here, look, if you don't rejoice when lost people are saved, you don't know me. And this is not, again, just a passive, I'm okay with it when people get saved, whatever. This is, I rejoice so much when lost people get saved. I'm actively seeking like Jesus did. I want to be part of this. I want to be a participant in this joy. I listened to several sermons on Luke 15, and I'll tell you, I'm jealous. There are preachers that I listen to that just have story after story after story of people that they've won to Christ. And I just listen with tears as they talk about all these stories. I wish I could do that. But your pastor is not a strong soul winner, and I'm not ashamed of that. Excuse me, I am. That was horrible. I am ashamed of that, and I pray for that to change. I can't point you to many stories in my own life, but I can point you to somebody better. I can point you to Jesus. I wish I could say imitate me as I imitate him, and I hope I can grow in this. But for right now, I just say imitate him. Just focus on the one who receives and recovers and rejoices over sinners when they're found. But maybe I could just go one step further and think that this applies not only in the realm of lost people, rejoicing over the lost when they're found, but maybe more generally, just rejoicing with the joyful when they receive any grace from God. we don't want to be like the older brother. Have you ever thought about this? I never thought about this before, so maybe you have. Probably you have. I just haven't thought about this. When the older brother, he's ticked off, right? And you see the assumptions that he makes? I mean, in essence, isn't what he's saying, my younger brother, lucky. I wish I was more like him. I mean, he has, so far as we know, as Jesus tells the story, he has no concept of the immense burden and trial that this younger brother has carried, does he? Because he's been out in the field. He hasn't heard the story. All he knows is that he was gone. He got to go out and blow his money. Lucky. This guy's he got all this money. He got to have prostitutes and all this stuff. And now, on top of everything else, he gets a fatted calf. Lucky. Right? I mean, it's like, and we should look at this and say, this guy's clueless, right? I mean, he's clueless. Like, you don't want this, you don't want his life. This guy has been miserable in his sin. And after misery and starvation, now he gets a fatted calf, and you're jealous. Now, sometimes we can't rejoice with other people who receive grace because we're jealous. We don't have a clue. Do you remember what Jesus said to Peter? Peter, they're walking after the resurrection, the end of John's gospel. And you remember Jesus just told Peter, you're going to die for me. And you remember what Peter did? What about him? What about John? You remember what Jesus said? If it's my plan that he lives until I come, what is that to you? Do your job. Feed my sheep. Don't get hung up on that stuff, right? And if it is, by the way, again, Peter didn't have a clue. And John is the only, by church history, is the only apostle who wasn't martyred. But I'm not sure John wouldn't have rather been killed than be on Patmos all by himself in exile, right? Sometimes we think we're jealous of people and we just don't have a clue. Why don't we just trust the God of sovereign grace who has a really good plan, like he's wise, right? And trust him that the grace he's given me is perfect for me and the grace that he gives to somebody else is perfect for them. Are you out there? And that frees us to rejoice with those who rejoice, right? Become like Jesus. I know I've told you before, remember the parable Jesus tells about all those vineyard workers in Matthew chapter 20, and you remember the punchline of that parable? The owner of the vineyard, again, is representative of God in his sovereign grace. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity? And parenthetically, do you begrudge my generosity to somebody else? Remember, the vineyard owner paid the guys that only worked 1 hour the same amount as those who worked all day. Was that unjust? No, it was just extremely generous. And those guys that worked all day, they begrudged his generosity to somebody else. If we want to be people who rejoice with the joyful because of God's grace to them, we've got to know this man. We've got to know this man. Otherwise, we too will miss it. After this, long after this, in Luke 15, you know what's coming? You remember the section of Luke this comes in? Jesus is on the road to where? Come on. He's on the road to where? To Jerusalem. Luke's made that clear at the end of Luke chapter 9. This section is the road to Jerusalem. And what awaits Jesus at Jerusalem? The cross. And Jesus is preparing, he knows this, he's preparing his disciples. And the fact that if we make that connection to Luke 15, it's as if, again, Jesus says, you say that I receive sinners, I'll see you and I'll raise you. I not only receive sinners, I recover them. And not only do I recover sinners, I rejoice when they're recovered. And it's as if you tie this to the cross, it's coming. Jesus says, I'll see that and I'll double down again. I not only accept the contempt that you will give me because I receive sinners and recover sinners and rejoice over sinners, I'm going to receive the contempt of the cross. And again, I'm not sure in our culture if we've lost a sense of this, but the cross was absolutely contemptible. To the Old Testament Jew, it was a curse to be hanged on a tree. Paul talks about the fact not only to Jews but also to Gentiles, the cross is both foolishness and weakness. Right? It's a scandal. It's shameful. But what Luke 15 is anticipating, Jesus is not only saying, yep, guilty. I'll take your insult and wear it as a badge of honor. Yes, I receive sinners. Yes, I recover sinners. Yes, I rejoice when sinners are found. And even more, I'm going to the cross to die in the place of sinners. And that how, though not in Luke 15, is certainly anticipated by Luke 15. Jesus is going to endure the cross and despise the shame for the joy that is set before him. Will you pray with me? Father, I thank you now for your word and the opportunity to consider it together this morning. What a treasure is your book. And what treasures open to us when we study and think and dig. And I thank you so much for helping us to see and understand what you're saying to us here in Luke 15. I thank you that you are a God who is overwhelmingly glorious, and that glory shows itself in grace. I pray you give us hearts like Moses that would pray to you, please, God, show us your glory. And I ask that you'd respond to us like you did to Moses, that you will let all of your goodness pass before us, that you will proclaim your name before us, that we will know you in the person of your Son, and that you will be gracious to whomever and however you will be gracious, and you will be merciful. You will show mercy to those to whomever and however you will show mercy. God, please, as you commanded light to shine out of darkness in creation, would you also command light to shine in our hearts to give us the light of the glory of the knowledge of God in the face of Jesus Christ. And we'll thank you for these things in Christ's name. Amen.